This talk is sponsored by the MIT Displacement Action and Research Network. It's a group of faculty and students who have begun to put our labor and our minds together to tackle the issues of displacement more generally. And it's also joined by, the sponsorship is joined by the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change at MIT. This talk is part of a year-long series of talks that we have on the issues of displacement and on a variety of different human rights issues that emerge from that. Following this talk, we have one more talk that I'll announce on November 30th by two community organizers, one from South Africa and another from Philippines, on the issue of global networking of the urban poor against and beyond evictions. And they're from the NGO Slum Dwellers International. And that will be in a different room. We'll advertise, we'll send a notice. And in case you want to be informed about this, please sign up to the PHRJ list at the Program on Human Rights and Justice at MIT, at the Center for International Studies. There's a sign-up list. You'll get information about all the events. We also have other events scheduled for the spring, so we are delighted to welcome today as one of our eminent speakers, Professor Olivier De Schutter. He is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. The UN Human Rights Mechanism in Geneva has a variety of different independent experts who investigate a range of different phenomena on housing and torture and a variety of different human rights problems that have global implications. And the right to food is, of course, one of the most fundamental issues for people around the world. And Professor Olivier De Schutter has done phenomenal work in recent years through his careful analysis, investigative reporting, and an assessment of where the most important critical challenges are for the realization of the right to food. And his reports are influential. They are read carefully by governments and civil society people, and they have a great deal of impact on thinking and action in the field of development as well as human rights. He is also a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain and at the College of Europe. He's a member of the Global Law faculty at NYU and is a visiting professor this semester at Columbia Law School. So without further ado, let me yield the floor to the professor.
Thank you. My great pleasure to be here, of course, in presence of Balakrishnan Rajagopal Raj, whose work is used a lot by researchers studying how social movements contribute to shape human rights law and use law in their social struggles. And so it's the first time we meet, but it's actually, my impression is that I've been familiar with Raj's work since quite a while. Let me briefly introduce our discussion by first describing what the new competition for land consists in, what the phenomenon is that we are speaking about, and then moving to the debates concerning the titling of property in order to protect land users from the risks of eviction. I tried to explain why this solution, although promoted by many agencies, may have a number of undesirable consequences, which may be sometimes underestimated. And then I propose an alternative approach to the question of how to protect land users from land grabbing, and I will explore the different scenarios that are ahead of us. So first of all, what is land grabbing? This is a map that I take from the Land Matrix project, which is the most impressive cross-country study of this increased pressure on land on a global scale, showing which are the target countries, which are the purchasing countries, or where the investors come from, and the Land Matrix project is quite remarkable because it is the most systematic analysis of this phenomenon. It captured some 1,217 large-scale deals since the year 2000. Large-scale meaning above 200 hectares of land. And altogether, they documented some 83 million hectares of land deals, or the equivalent of 83 million hectares of land. They tried to cross-examine, cross-check a number of the reports they received concerning land grabbing, and they could confirm for a significant portion of these reported deals that there had been indeed a shift in land rights, covering altogether 32 million hectares. And that is, to give you an idea, the surface of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands combined. So it's a quite large surface. And these are estimates that are confirmed by World Bank research. In 2011, as some of you may know, the World Bank published a very widely advertised report on this issue called Rising Interest in Farmland. And they estimated that the amount of land that had changed hands in the period of less than a year between October 2008 and August 2009 was the equivalent to about 56 million hectares. So these are relatively comparable estimates that we have concerning the scope of the phenomenon. To give you just one last idea of the scope that this is taking, if we consider only land deals in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region that is most targeted, altogether the land deals represent the equivalent of the land mass of Kenya. So it's a very significant amount of land. Now, many of these investments in land serve to produce not food, but other agricultural commodities that serve to a large extent export markets and do not contribute to improving food security. On the left-hand side of this slide, you have an estimate of the Land Matrix project, which I've already mentioned, concerning the different crops that are cultivated on the land that is being acquired in this process. And as you can see, although a significant proportion goes to producing food, one reason for this is that in 2007, 2008, we saw a very rapid increase of the food prices globally on international markets. We had a second crisis in 2010 and another one in 2011. And so more and more countries, and indeed agribusiness corporations, understand that supply of foodstuffs is becoming less and less reliable. And they want to secure these supplies by vertically integrating for agribusiness corporations or by purchasing land to produce food for their populations in the case of some rich countries that are resource poor. So they use, in that case, land to produce food, but in fact, in many cases, land is used to produce something else. For example, non-food crops represent 26% of the cultivated areas. Non-food is, of course, rubber, fiber, jatropha. Flex crops are crops that may serve either to produce energy or food, for example, soybean, sugarcane, palm oil, and some land is used for different crops being produced at the same time. The World Bank has also made these estimates and arrives at roughly equivalent conclusions. In its September 2011 report I already mentioned, they found that 21% of the large-scale land acquisitions were used to produce agro-energy biofuels. 21% serve to produce cash crops, and food crops represent a significant proportion, but still a minority in the global picture. So this is very important because it also shows that this scramble for land in developing countries is linked to the merger between the food energy markets and to basically the increased demand for agricultural commodities that is not, strictly speaking, demand for food exclusively. This is a graph that shows, again, very recent data showing, based on the estimates of the Land Matrix project, showing which continents are concerned. The vast majority of these large-scale land deals concern sub-Saharan Africa. 56 million hectares, according to the full picture provided by the Land Matrix project, of land deals have occurred in Africa. 18 million hectares in Asia, primarily in the Philippines, Laos, and Indonesia. In the Americas, there is some of this going on too, in Brazil, Argentina in particular, and to a much lesser extent, we have land grabbing occurring on other continents. What's very striking is that 68% of these land deals occur in 11 countries only, so it's very concentrated on a relatively narrow range of countries that are generally weakly governed, have land available according at least to the governments who decide how land is to be allocated. And these 11 countries are primarily sub-Saharan African countries: Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania, the DRC, Madagascar are the main targets of these deals. Now, when this phenomenon began to be discussed in 2008, 2009, as a result of the global food price crisis and as a result of a very impressive attempt by some South Korean company to acquire 1.3 million hectares of land in Madagascar, some of you may recall this, which made the headlines in the Financial Times in particular, there were many debates about the risks and opportunities presented by this development. And the opportunities were said to be essentially at three levels. First, by acquiring land in developing countries which had not invested sufficiently in agricultural development over the past 30 years, it was said, investors would contribute to improving infrastructure, storage facilities, roads, transport, communications, and thus to link certain lands to markets when these lands had been hitherto isolated and unable to be connected to the markets. And it's interesting, actually this is one of the least used but most interesting data from the Land Matrix project. It shows the distance separating the land that is acquired by these large investors from the markets. And it's interesting because you see that a significant proportion of the lands concerned are actually quite remotely located, far away from the markets, over 9 hours from the first small town city, allowing the producer to market his or her crops. And so you might say, well, if investment serves to better connect those areas to the markets, it may benefit rural development and economic growth. But what's also remarkable in this graph is that a significant proportion, an even more significant proportion of the lands that are targeted by these deals are actually not too badly connected to the markets, right? If you take just the lands that are less than 3 hours away from the markets, it represents roughly 40% of the land concerned. In other terms, while some investments may contribute to linking cultivated lands to markets, most of the investments go to the land that is already best connected, most desirable, and for which the competition is therefore the most important. And I personally am very skeptical when some investors, some agencies say, well, there's lots of land available, so there's no problem in having investors come in and buy off land, because really land is more or less fertile, more or less well located, more or less hilly or instead flat, and the quality of the land therefore matters significantly, and the competition is harshest, is more severe for the land that is, of course, most productive and best located. The second argument in favor of these investments was it would create employment. And of course, these are promises that investors make when they enter into a country, that they will create employment. The question is really one of opportunity costs here. Most of these large-scale investments will create some employment, but they are not really going to encourage labor-intensive types of agriculture. And one has to compare the employment created by these investors with the employment losses that result from land being lost by the local communities, of course. In addition, that's why I mentioned opportunity costs, and I'll return to this issue. It begs the question how much employment would be created if we invested in a different type of agriculture, more labor-intensive, but perhaps better suited to reducing rural poverty. A third argument in favor of these investments is that it would stimulate economic growth. Again, this is a point I shall return to. Let me just flag that much of the small-scale family agriculture practiced in developing countries is not computed in the GDP growth of these countries, simply because people produce land for their families, their communities, without it becoming tradable goods that are, if you wish, exchanged on the market and therefore taxed and computed in GDP growth. So the idea that we must invest to stimulate economic growth is a bit biased if we consider how large segments of the economy in developing countries are actually not computed in economic growth. There are, on the other hand, beyond these opportunities, very important risks with this development. And Tim Wise, who joined us, I welcome very much, is very familiar with these risks. First of all, local food security may be threatened by these developments. And the reason for this is very simple. Most of the investments that are documented, and here I speak based on the data of the World Bank and the Land Matrix Project, although these percentages are from the Land Matrix Project, most of the investments serve to produce export crops, cash crops, not to supply the local markets and to contribute thus to enhanced food availability in the countries concerned. In fact, only 9% of the surfaces cultivated, according to the Land Matrix Project, would go to supplying the local markets. The vast majority of what's cultivated goes to export markets, to the countries of origin of the investors, particularly when these are public investors, governments, sovereign wealth funds, investing to ensure their food security at home. And it's remarkable to note that in many cases where these investments are made, they are made in countries that are already food deficient, sometimes dependent on food aid, and will have their dependence worsen, in fact, as a result of these investments. We also know that there are environmental consequences linked with the development of large-scale mechanized industrial farming. Monocropping accelerates erosion, and the use of fertilizers and pesticides may destroy the biological components of the soil. I can't enter into details here, but essentially the type of farming that is promoted by these large-scale investments are not types of farming that best maintain the ecosystems and the health of the soils. Thirdly, there is, of course, a strong competition between these investors and the local communities. And let me give you just a few figures to explain what this competition represents. This first graph shows how the land was used before the investor came in. Right? Again, this is from the Land Matrix Project. They looked at 82 land deals for which they had such data, and they found that for these 82 deals, in 56 cases, it is smallholder production that was replaced by large-scale agro-industrial production. In 16 of these cases, the land was actually not privatized or used by any producer in particular. These are common pool resources that essentially serve to collect fuel wood or to have livestock graze and common land that is used by some groups who depend on access to these commons for their livelihoods. So it is one first indicator of how these shifts in land rights are increasing competition between local communities and these investors. Another indication is given if we look at who were the former owners of the land. So based on data from 90 large-scale deals, the Land Matrix project showed that in 51 of these cases, so this is about 60%, the land was actually owned by the state. This is not in contradiction with what I just said concerning land being used by smallholder agriculture, because in fact in many sub-Saharan African countries, land is actually owned by the state, but the state tolerates the use of the land by small-scale farmers, although these farmers have no legal title to the land that they occupy and on which they depend. So what happens is the state simply decides that there is an opportunity for it to sell off land to deep-pocketed investors. Without consulting the local communities, in many cases, the land is given away to them, and the local land users lose their access to the land on which they depend. The graph on the right-hand side of the slide illustrates this again. Based on some 86 projects, the Land Matrix project found that in the vast majority of them, there was no consultation whatsoever of the local communities. There was limited consultation in maybe 40% of the cases, and in only a very small number of cases was there full consent sought and obtained from the communities before the investment proceeded. And of course, as a result of all this, many of these projects go hand in hand with evictions, sometimes on a relatively large scale. Based on 40 projects they analyzed in this respect, for which they had data, the researchers from the Land Matrix project found that in 15 cases, there were, so this is about 40%, I suppose, of the projects analyzed. There were between 1 and 1,000 evictions. In the other cases, there were even larger numbers of evictions, people evicted from the lands on which they depended. So that is land grabbing. And it is a phenomenon that, although it has been accelerating since 2008, 2009, is not entirely new, not entirely unprecedented. In fact, some see this as a new wave of neo-colonial practices in which the North, cash-rich investors and countries capture the resources from the global South, and this is a comparison which may be a useful tool to understand in geopolitical terms what is happening. What I'm interested in is looking at the reactions of the international community and what has been done about this, and whether the choices made in order to protect land users are the right ones. And here, let me note the following. Most agencies working on these issues, and indeed most governments, have considered that the urgent task was to protect land users from the risk of eviction by providing them with a land title, a deed to the land that they were cultivating. Now, that reaction is quite natural because for many years, titling schemes were promoted as one key instrument to fight against poverty in developing countries. And in fact, during one decade, which roughly is between 1995 and 2005, titling was really presented by many actors, not least the World Bank, as a major policy that should be pursued to promote economic growth and the reduction of poverty in developing countries. There were essentially three arguments for this. The first argument was that by securing property rights and essentially exporting the Western concept of private property rights in developing countries, investors would be attracted, and thus capital inflows would result for developing countries who have too little capital they can benefit from and who invest too little. And in fact, the World Bank developed this doing business ranking of countries, which of course measures whether the investment climate is right in the countries, and one of the major indicators of this doing business annual report is, are property rights effectively secured? I found out that my own country, Belgium, was very poorly rated in this doing business ranking, some top countries were from the Gulf states, for example. It's an interesting way of looking at countries, this doing business ranking. The idea here is also to emphasize property rights as a way to encourage efficiency in the way resources are allocated. And this is why you have here the picture of Ronald Coase. Much of the discussion on titling and the merits of titling is based on this idea that if you privatize property rights, if you secure private property rights, land will go to those who are best at using it most effectively. Right? The reason being that if you're an investor competent enough to have the land produce revenue, you will put more cash on the table to acquire the land, because the cash you will put on the table is commensurate with the income stream you can expect in the following years. So land, if we create market for land rights, land should go to the most efficient users, the best investors, if you wish, those that can use the land most productively. That is one major argument, right? Land rights, market for land rights as a source of economic efficiency. Another argument is the one put forward, and that is why you have his picture, by Hernando de Soto, who, with the Institute for Liberty and Democracy in Lima, in Peru, promoted a massive titling program in Peru beginning in 1998. And Hernando de Soto published, following this experience, his book on showing how capital in developing countries was often debt capital that could not be mobilized because it was not secured in the hands of those who own it. The idea of Hernando de Soto is essentially that land should be secured to be transformed into capital that can be mortgaged in order for the owners to have access to credit and to invest on land in order to produce incomes. That is the logic that Hernando de Soto, in the Mystery of Capital, his book of 2000, based on the Peruvian experience, presents. The first remarkable thing about these two first arguments I've described is they are, of course, perfectly contradictory. Because the first argument tells us, look, if you create a market for land rights, it shall lead land to shift from the least efficient to the most efficient users. And the second argument tells us, if you secure land rights, it shall allow those who currently own the land without being the recognized legal owners to use it more productively. And these are, of course, contradictory views of what a market for land rights should allow to develop. A third and last argument is, by titling schemes, you will allow the state to impose taxation on those who will have formally recognized property, And that may also favor the state providing public services, although that argument is primarily relevant for urban slum dwellers benefiting from titling. So that was essentially the mantra, the key arguments in the titling decade of 1995-2005. Now, since then, we have grown increasingly dissatisfied with titling. And I'd say that there are now a number of arguments against titling that show how disappointed we have become with titling and how the discontent with titling has increased. First of all, many of these arguments, particularly those of Hernando de Soto, relate much more to urban slum dwellers than to titling for the rural poor. And the difference is important. For those of you working on the development of capitalism, and you may have, for example, worked on the work of Macpherson concerning the origins of capitalist development in the 17th, 18th century. For the rural populations, land is not simply an asset that is a commodity that can be traded through the market. Land is an essential factor of production on which their livelihoods depend. For the urban slum dwellers, if they lose the house and if they have to move to another neighborhood, maybe far away, further away from work, it may be the source of a discomfort, it may be a problem in the quality of their lives. But for the small rural household, losing land is a total disaster simply because they have nothing else. They have no other source of income than the income they manage to produce by the land on which they cultivate. And in addition, in many developing countries, land is more than an economic asset. It is a source of social citizenship. It is a source of social integration. It allows you to be a decent citizen in that society. I remember having discussed these issues inter alia in a consultation I had in Chennai, in southeastern India. And people told me there, look, if I don't have land, I can't marry my daughter. I can't marry her well, in other terms, because not being a landowner is a source of social degradation, and that is something they cannot simply afford. The implication of this is that even if they were able to mortgage their land, they would not want to do so because they don't want to take the risk of losing their land if it is mortgaged, and if indeed they found themselves unable to reimburse their debts. I already mentioned the second problem with titling and the second concern that it raised. There's a huge ambiguity. Is titling, after all, there to secure the tenure of current land users and to protect them from eviction, which is the main justification in development discourse? Or is it there to create a market for land rights, allowing land to go to the most efficient land user, allowing land to go to the investor with the deepest pockets, who can basically speculate on land much better than the poor rural households. And depending on which significance you want to give to titling, of course, the implications will be very different. What was also increasingly found was that for many rural poor, titling is not a solution because it makes land often unaffordable for them. It's not unusual that the titling process is captured by the elites who can best use the bureaucratic structures, who can bribe public officials on who titling depends. And in many cases, the poor rural households, even once they receive this title to the land, they just are unable to keep the land because of the taxes that will be imposed on them which they cannot repay, because they fall in debt, and they sometimes are tempted to sell off their land to pay back their debts in what is, in effect, distressed sales. Or sometimes we see what some call the windfall effect, by which I mean this. When land is titled, its value increases. And all studies show that the increase is about 25–30%. When the value of land thus increases because of titling, it is very tempting for the rural family to sell off the land for the equivalent of 3 years of harvest, because it's the first time they had so much cash in their pockets. And then they buy one motorcycle, perhaps. They can acquire some goods of that sort. But then, what next? Nothing much, because they have no qualifications allowing them to seek employment in other sectors, and they've lost the land on which really their lifeline was depending. So, in many cases, the poor end up being priced out from these markets, which become, for them, a source of exclusion rather than a source of inclusion. Fourth and finally, in many cases, these titling schemes were superimposed on existing customary forms of tenure that were socially legitimate and recognized, so that instead of reducing the amount of conflicts over land, titling projects have sometimes increased conflicts because of the coexistence of two different legal systems. That was certainly what we saw happening in many parts of Africa. So these findings were confirmed by the work of this UN High-Level Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor that was co-chaired by Hernando de Soto and Madeleine Albright. This is a nice picture, which I think is a nice illustration of Hernando de Soto seeing his theories disproven by the realities they were discovering, and Madeleine Albright working at identifying solutions for the 21st century. And so the commission on the high-level commission on the legal empowerment of the poor was mandated by a number of governments to work on essentially how to reduce poverty in developing countries by improving the rule of law, the protection that legal systems could provide the poor, particularly as regards access to land. And it was co-chaired by Hernando de Soto, and actually if you read the terms of reference of the High-Level Commission, it's very clear. The idea was to prove de Soto right. But in fact, they worked for 3 years, and they came up with conclusions that are far more nuanced than what the titling fad would have promoted. A short excerpt of their conclusions, and I apologize if this citation looks a bit long, but it encapsulates the message of the High-Level Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. It says this: promoting a truly inclusive property rights system that incorporates measures to strengthen tenure security requires learning from mixed experience with past individual titling programs. To ensure protection and inclusion of the poorest, a broad range of policy measures should be considered. These include formal registration or formal recognition, adequate representation, integration of a variety of forms of land tenure such as customary rights, indigenous peoples' rights, group rights, and certificates. Success depends greatly upon comprehensively reforming the governance system surrounding property rights. These systems need to be accessible, affordable, transparent, and free from unnecessary complexity. Above all, the poor must be protected from arbitrary eviction by due process and full compensation. So the message is that the priority should go to protecting security of tenure, protecting the poor from eviction, that a market for land rights should not be an end in itself, that customary forms of tenure deserve to be recognized and supported, and that in many cases titling schemes had a mixed record, particularly as regards the reduction of rural poverty. And indeed, the High-Level Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor based its findings on the evidence that came out from this decade of titling. Just some of this evidence. First of all, titling schemes have often encouraged not just the arrival of investors in capital-scarce countries, but also speculation on land, inflated prices of land, resulting in increased concentration. In fact, in some countries which have developed titling schemes, the impact has been greater rather than lesser concentration of land, simply because land becomes easier to acquire by those with the highest purchasing power, who often are already the local landowners' elites. The titling process is often captured by the elites. Sometimes what happens is that hearing about a titling scheme being prepared, the elites, sometimes gentlemen farmers who live in the cities but want to invest in farming, they go to the poor and they offer a price for the land that is higher than the market price before the titling scheme begins. And for the poor, this is very tempting. Suddenly, they will be able to have lots of cash at once, and they don't realize that actually the value of land in the next 2 or 3 years shall increase significantly as a result of a titling scheme being implemented. We've seen this in quite a few countries. The productivity gains that were expected to result from titling schemes have not always materialized. Certainly, to invest in land, you need to be secured in your access to land, and you will not invest in reshaping the landscape, in planting trees, for example, if you have no security of tenure. But security of tenure is what matters, not the possibility to sell off the land to the highest bidder. And in fact, there are some data from my friend Jean-Philippe Plateau working on Burkina Faso, for example, that show that the relationship between titling on the one hand and investments in land is not simply that titling favors investment, it's rather the other way around. Once you have investments in land, your tenure is more secure because you will not be tempted to sell off the land if you manage to make a productive use of your land and to live decently off the land that allows you not to have to sell it to survive. So, in other terms, the priority should go to protecting security of tenure, to allowing farmers to invest in land, but not to create a market for land rights. The evidence we have also shows the benefits from customary forms of tenure. In many cases, it was found, and the work of Elinor Ostrom, of course, illustrates this extremely well. The management by local communities of land that is not privatized, right, the common pool resources, as she called this, can be extremely effective in ensuring that the carrying capacity of the land shall not be exceeded, and in ensuring an adequate monitoring by the local communities of the various users of the land or resources on it. And so we have discovered over the past few years the benefits of recognizing customary forms of tenure and communal property over land, and that is part of this discontent with titling schemes. And then finally, I should say that women always lose. They lose when we simply sanctify the existing uses of land in the hands of local communities, because in many cases women have no voice in these communities and are marginalized in the existing forms of tenure, but they also lose from titling schemes. I looked at the FAO stat data for a report I did on access to land in 2010, and these are the results. When you look at who gets the title in these different countries that are used as examples, of course the figures depend on the date when the studies were made of titling programs in these countries. But in a very small number of countries, do you have more than 20% of the titles that have gone to women. In the vast majority of countries, more than 80% of the titling schemes have led to titles being given to men, or more than 80% of the titles rather have been benefiting men. Men are simply presumed to be the legitimate owners of the land which the household uses. Men are those who are best informed about titling processes. Men are those who can travel to the town to obtain the certificate, and they give their own name, not the name of their wife or their partner, when they seek to have the land certified. So essentially, the titling process has been captured by men and by the elites. So that is the situation today. Discontent about titling and the search for alternatives to protect security of tenure. And what I would like to propose is that we need to search in a different direction. And I really look forward to, I hope, the work we can do together, Raj, on these issues, how to reinvent property rights from below, to borrow from the beautiful title of the book by Raj on international law from below. And the idea is this: property rights come in different sizes and shapes. And in many cases, we have to be inventive to design property rights regimes that are best suited to the needs of the poorest communities in developing countries. And the superimposition of the Western concept of property rights, right, as individual, as exclusive, as allowing commodification, is not the only concept that we have at our disposal. There are a wide range of institutions we can borrow from and combine with one another to identify what is most effective. Some examples, which I develop in my reports to the Human Rights Council in particular. So first of all, anti-eviction laws have been adopted in some countries, which do not grant full property titles, but simply, but crucially, protect existing land users from the risks of eviction. So you may not force people out from the land they cultivate, occupy, without seeking an authorization by a judicial process. This is a way to, in the short term, protect from the risks of eviction and basically avoiding the social disruptions that could result from the large scale arrival of investors suddenly interested in the increased value of farmland. That is one institution or one technique we certainly could use and explore. Secondly, tenancy laws. It is very common for the poorest among the poor in the rural areas in developing countries to be tenants on land that they do not own, that is owned by large, rich landowners. In many cases, these tenants cultivate the land against either a fee they pay on an annual basis. Sometimes they share part of the crops, right? Part of the harvest goes to the landowner. And the situation of these tenants is often extremely insecure and fragile. So tenancy laws, providing a status to tenants, protecting them from eviction, allowing the spouse, the children to inherit if they happen to decease, allowing them to buy land if the landowner intends to sell it and to give them a preemption right, allowing them to have proof that they occupied the land as tenants to allow them to have access to credit. These are many benefits that could accrue to tenants should tenants be given, if you wish, a legal status, which in many cases they are denied. And this idea of tenancy laws is one that I studied particularly in the Indian context. Some states, Gujarat in particular, have developed this and done this with quite some degree of success. Thirdly, and this is fully compatible with the protection of tenancy of tenants and with anti-eviction laws. Whilst I have my doubts about a market for land rights, allowing the transfer of property rights. I do believe that a market for rental rights may be very important. The reason is that many rural poor today are poor because the land they have access to is just too small. They need to be able to have access to more land and to cultivate more to make a decent living from farming. For them, because they have no capital, it may be good to be able to rent land in adequate conditions, and supporting a market for rental rights may be something that could benefit them. Fourth and finally, we need, I believe, in many regions, agrarian reform, and here I have to be very, very cautious and clear. Agrarian reform is not just land distribution. Agrarian reform, in fact, is about equitable access to land, certainly, but it is especially about supporting land users in their ability to make a productive use of the land in order to be able to thrive by using this land, by having access to various services, to various types of support from the state, and to live well from this land they are attributed. So we should not imagine agrarian reform as simply a matter of access to land. It's also a matter of all these services and an ability to live from small-scale farming. So finally, let me conclude by saying we are now at a crossroads between three possibilities. One is to have the current transition scenario develop and accelerate. Transition scenario is a scenario which is unfolding before our eyes, in which increasingly small-scale farmers are being forced to exit agriculture, forced to migrate to the cities because of their lack of competitiveness and the lack of support from the governments. They are unable to live decently from farming, and the transition is the agrarian transition, in which more and more large-scale agro-industrial farming develops at the expense of small-scale farming. It is, unfortunately, the most likely scenario today. A second scenario would be a coexistence scenario, in which these two worlds of farming, the large-scale agro-industrial plantation-like farming, producing for large markets, coexists with small-scale family farming. And here let me say this. These two worlds of farming are competing for land, water, access to investment, access to political influence. They are objectively competitors. But the fight between them is highly unequal. Why? Because large-scale agro-industrial farming is more competitive. They are better at producing food on a large scale for global markets, and because it is a type of farming that is not labor intensive, they can dump food on the markets at a relatively low price for the consumers. Small-scale family farming is less competitive, but it is highly productive per hectare. We have many studies showing that the smaller the farm is, the larger the output per surface is. So it's highly productive in the use it makes of natural resources. It's a type of farming that is labor intensive. So it contributes to creating employment in rural areas where many people are underemployed, in fact. It contributes to rural development, and it contributes to the alleviation of rural poverty. It also is best at preserving the ecosystems and at developing types of farming that are better managing the ecosystems and producing in an agroecological manner. For all these reasons, small-scale farming has a number of positive externalities to provide for which it deserves to be rewarded. But if the market has its way, the competition will be benefiting the agro-industrial plantation, not the small-scale farmers. So the state must manage this coexistence in a very careful, balanced way if it is to succeed. Some states do manage this. Brazil is one example. Finally, there's a third scenario, which is the reform scenario, in which we would invest seriously in small-scale farming. And that means not preserving the statu quo, not just preserving subsistence agriculture as it exists in order to avoid it disappearing under the pressure of market forces, which is what Paul Collier, for example, denounces as the romantic view. The reform scenario is seriously asking what small-scale farmers need to thrive, to succeed, to become more productive, and to indeed provide an alternative to the transition scenario we are witnessing. That third scenario is not the most likely for the moment, but it is the one on which, over the past couple of years, increasingly there has been growing an international consensus, at least within the body that is now at global level trying to address recommendations to governments as to how food security should be promoted and supported. And this body is the Committee on World Food Security, competing with the G20 to shape the international agenda in these areas. This competition between various instances of global governance is one Tim Wise, again, has worked on a lot recently. And the Committee on World Food Security has adopted in May 2012 a set of guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries and forests in the context of national food security. And Guideline 12.6 is on large-scale investments, insisting on the need to protect legitimate tenure rights, insisting on the need to be more transparent in how land is allocated, insisting on the need to avoid concentration of land ownership. And indeed, these guidelines also express and recommend to governments to promote agrarian reform to support equitable access to land in another guideline, Guideline 15.1 and 15.3 of these voluntary guidelines. So that is, in a nutshell, the situation that we are facing. I would like now to thank you very warmly for your patient attention, and I look forward to our exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. Splendid, highly informative presentation. I'm going to open the floor, but I'm going to assert my privilege as chair to ask you a couple of questions to get the conversation going. And which has to do with the reform scenario. Let's start from where you ended. Because if I tell this problem of that you're identifying now, and to some of my colleagues here, they're likely to turn around and say, well, you have to realize that agriculture basically sucks. Agriculture is a back-breaking occupation, and people want to escape from it, as opposed, especially subsistence agriculture of the kind that you're talking about. What we need to know is what's really the connection between the subsistence agriculture and food security. In other words, is the food security of the people in different countries intimately connected to the output from the subsistence farms? Or is it more, how is it actually met? Because it's actually that's your mandate, the question of how right to food is actually met, which was not, of course, the focus of your presentation, which was more about more structural, deep-rooted issues, particularly over property rights and approaches to that. But I was wondering if you might say something about how, what are the current patterns of agricultural productivity in different countries, and how that relates to achievement of the right to food, and where are the main threats coming from, etc. The second comment that I have has to do with the question of land grab. You describe these as land grab, and I have a little bit of puzzle about how exactly we might characterize these as land grab, in the sense in which we might think of, say, Native American land being grabbed by Europeans arriving here. You plant a flag and declare the land as terra nullius, and the land is yours. So obviously it's not that kind of land grab we're talking about. It's governments are at the core of it. As you say, much of the land was government land. The governments enabled this land grab to happen. So it's legal. It's in fact with the approval of governments that, for a variety of different reasons, we might not want to characterize them as representative or truly democratic, etc., but they are the governments of these societies. And that is, the trick is, the reason I mention that is because every time we raise questions about, for example, the nature of investment in land and so on, it gets into tricky issues about sovereignty. Countries turn around and say, who the hell are you to actually lecture us about this issue? We'll decide what we want to do. As you know very well, the Ethiopian president responded that way when there was some criticism of land deals in Ethiopia, essentially saying there's a new colonialism, which is not about the land grab. It's others telling us about how we should deal with our own land. So there is that issue about how exactly should we understand this land grab? Are they in the form of long-term leases? Are they in the form of outright purchases? And if so, who owns them? And well, so yeah, that's kind of one issue to clarify. And I suppose a couple of other questions. Let me just put them on the agenda. One is, who are the investors? I mean, you talked about the countries where the land is being targeted, but the investing countries. Who are these investors? Are they all Western or companies, or are they among the BRICS, or who are these companies? And where are they investing? Is there a pattern to it? Do we see that Western companies, by and large, invest in Africa, whereas the Latin American ones get investment from, say, Brazil and so on? So who are these villains here? So we need to know something about that. And finally, how are the communities themselves responding to it? How are they able to organize a response politically? Are they mobilizing? If so, what are the mechanisms that they're using, legal or political, both at the local level and regional, transnational, etc.? So in your own mechanism, the UN, the role of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, I know, is a key part of some right to food campaigns where they've relied on your reports to mobilize public attention and bring political attention to land issues that otherwise remain under the radar screen. So yeah.
Okay. Well, this is certainly enough for us to go on for 1 more hour.
Sorry, I probably said too much, but it's really exciting for me to...
It's a very crucial set of questions. So let me try, however, to answer as briefly as possible. First of all, this notion of subsistence agriculture, it's ambiguous. It's not an expression I'm particularly fond of. I think one major danger is to compare the benefits of investors coming in and injecting capital into agriculture, as some have written, including unfortunately Jose Graziano da Silva, the Director General of the FAO, fertilizing land with money was the expression he used. Comparing that with the status quo of small-scale subsistence agriculture is an alternative I'm refusing. The reform scenario is one that seeks to move beyond this alternative. So it's not conservationist in that sense. It says rather that investing in small-scale farmers can indeed, to answer your question, benefit food security. It can do so in two ways. First of all, because if you strengthen the ability for rural households to feed themselves by using the land that they own, that, all cross-country studies show this, represents a major buffer against acute malnutrition. So families who have some land on which they can cultivate to feed themselves and reduce their dependency on the volatility of market prices to feed themselves are protected from hunger, severe malnutrition. It doesn't mean they will become rich. It means they will at least avoid being subjected to hunger, malnutrition. That is, if you wish, subsistence agriculture, but it is something that deserves support, if for no better reason, at least for that reason. But secondly, small-scale agriculture, in which people cultivate the land that they own, instead of large landowners having fewer people work on large plantations, is one way to support rural development and to increase the incomes in rural areas. And this is not only good for these rural populations benefiting from whichever strategies we should deploy to support those small-scale farmers, it's also good for the other sectors of the economy. There are more and more studies now showing the multiplier effects of supporting small-scale agriculture. And the major effect is that when you increase the incomes of these rural households, they become a market for the local providers of services, for the local producers of manufactured goods. And this is, if you wish, a Keynesian effect. It leads to the local economy benefiting with considerable multiplier effects resulting. Instead, if you supported the large landowners, they would buy, luxury items. They would buy one tractor that they would import from the US or Germany. They would not inject into the local economy quite as much as the small-scale farmers, as rural households. So for the second reason, investing in small-scale farmers can benefit food security, but note that in none of these, under none of these arguments am I advocating for simply the statu quo. So I think it's unfair to compare the arrival of investors with simply the existing situation. Your second question, Raj, was concerning the role of the host governments, the target governments. And yes, you are right, this raises sensitivities. I have, I suppose, three answers, although they are not neatly separated from one another. First of all, the rights to development and the right to self-determination are rights that are not simply rights that governments have to choose their development pathways and to choose how to exploit their natural resources. There are also rights the population has against the government. And these are human rights which populations may claim against governments who are not acting in the best interests of the long-term development of their populations. And so I think we have to take, as you said, as you did in your question, with a grain of salt, the pretense of governments to know best what their population actually needs. In many cases, the history does not plead in favor of these governments' assertion to be representative of all the population, and particularly small-scale farmers have been marginalized from decision-making processes because they are illiterate, poor, not interesting either as an economic sector or as a political constituency. And this lack of voice, of political representation of small-scale farmers is a major explanation for why we have underinvested in them. And third and finally, frankly, what we're seeing with this land grabbing is a new chapter in the sad history of the resource curse in developing countries. The resource curse is a situation in which governments have some natural resources to sell that will bring about short-term benefits to the governments, the elites in power, at the expense of the long-term development interests of the population. Essentially, governments able to sell off land to foreign investors and to capture some bribes in the process will be tempted to do so at a low price. The typical price that these investors pay is $1 per hectare per year.
It doesn't cost them anything.
Sorry?
It doesn't cost them anything.
It doesn't cost them anything except that they do some investments on the land and so on, but it still is a very good deal for these investors, and it's a very good deal for the governments because the governments pocket this money, and when they lose power, it's money that will stay with them, unfortunately, in many cases, because there's very little transparency on how the revenues are used. So while I'm fully aware with this sensitivity you described, I have no qualms in asking these questions about the real long-term benefits of selling off these assets or leasing them out for 30 or 99 years, as many governments, including the Ethiopian governments, have been doing in the past few years. At the same time, these are countries in a very difficult situation. They have no money they can invest in rural development. They lack capital and infrastructure, and the only way they can develop their agriculture is by calling on foreign investors to come in the country. So what I hope, perhaps naively, is that they will increasingly ask these investors to invest in small-scale farming by providing training, by providing access to credit, to markets, but not by leading to a shift in land rights as in large-scale land deals. The third question Raji had was about the investors, who they are. It's complex, so I'm not going to describe this in detail. I would simply say that the most visible part of the iceberg is governments of capital-rich but resource-poor countries who invest to secure the long-term food security of their populations. For example, the Gulf states, South Korea, China, and indeed sometimes India. India is both a target and a buyer in this process. But in fact, the major land deals are in the hands of the private sector, and investment funds who sometimes only speculate on increasing demand for land, have no industrial project, agro-industrial project whatsoever, and simply see this as a suitable way to develop a diversified asset portfolio in the hope that the price of land will increase and that they will make a benefit selling it off in a few years' time. About 80% of these large-scale deals are by the private sector, and some of these are by local investors, not just foreign investors. Fourth, finally, local communities. What responses? There are very few remedies available. There's now an attempt to use courts to protect their land rights, but these remedies are often not promising because the courts are not entirely independent. They are sometimes corrupt. They take time to decide cases. I'm now following very closely, for example, a case in Uganda where a community of some 2,000 people were evicted for one coffee producer from Germany to use their land, and they are before court since 10 years, right? And nothing is moving, and it's extremely time-consuming, expensive, and the prospects are highly uncertain. So I think organizing better, being better represented in the political process, having a voice in parliament, and ensuring that the parliament monitors what the government is doing in the name of the country is perhaps the best avenue for these communities.
Okay. Let's open it up. Let's start with you.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I particularly like the part where you went to the title and decade and sort of juxtaposed the close argument.
Can you all hear?
Speak louder.
Can you speak louder?
I was talking about the section that you had on the titling decade where you sort of contrasted the close argument where sort of land rights are entrenched, usually with an elite that is able to productively use the land versus the De Schutter argument, which is a bit more democratic in terms of current owners that have land rights that they can then leverage for other purposes in terms of using it for capital and mortgaging. And then you sort of, at the end, talked about other approaches such as tenancy laws and tenancy rights, which I think is an interesting opportunity, but how would you sort of evade some of the problems that you found in the De Schutter approach? Some of these things I think you would find replication in terms of elite capture. And then what do the rights actually mean? For example, what would governments do in terms of potential eviction cases and compensation issues? One of the problems that I think you find with state governments is that when an eviction process is going on, they're unable to compensate for tenants, so they only deal with the landowners. So you have this sort of mid-layer of landowners, and then you have a layer of tenants. So how would those rights that are sort of competing against each other for government resources be addressed? And then in terms of enforceability, I think that's another question that would come up in tenant rights.
Given that we have, technically we are supposed to close at 1:30, but unless there are people banging on the door, there might be.
We have the room until 2.
Until 2, so we could continue for a little bit longer if people want to ask questions. Do you want to take some of them together?
Yeah, I think it will make time management easier.
Sir, you. Either of you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, last fall, you issued a communique along with your colleagues, the Rapporteur on water and the Rapporteur on buildings, about the blatantly discriminatory land policies in the occupied territories in East Jerusalem. You talked about eviction, displacement, and destruction of agricultural production facilities. How has the situation there changed since then, and what do you think should be done about that virulent land grab in both of those places?
Very special case, obviously, yeah.
You mentioned land speculation being a big part of the land grab issue. I'm interested in what percentage of that, and if there's a way of making that, if that's a lot of the buying that's happening, is there a way of making it possible for tenants to continue working on the land, and in which case it would be less of an issue if other people own it and speculate on it going up in price. And another question, in comparing a small farm situation to large agribusiness, one of the challenges I would see on the small farm side is redistribution of the food produced from agricultural areas to non-agricultural areas. If you have any thoughts on that?
Let's take one more, and then when we get to this set of questions. Let's take one from the back, Sarah.
I just have a quick question about, you mentioned towards the end about what you can ask investors to do with respect to transitioning the resource curse to more of a resource blessing. And you mentioned a couple of things, provide credit. I didn't quite catch the other things, so if you could repeat those. And then also, are you making an assumption that these institutional systems are in place in order for the investors to do that? Because that's kind of what it sounds like, provide credit, but if there's no conduit for credit, then what really, in a developing context, can investors do real time?
Okay, so first of all, for your first question, which very rightly, although politely, expresses a skepticism as to the plausibility of my reform scenario, given the existing realities in many developing countries of institutions that are not trustworthy, governments that are not accountable, elites that are not checked by adequate checks and balances and counterpower of social movements. All this is true. So I think we have to realize that it's going to be a difficult and long-term process. But in the short term, there are things we can do already to protect people from being robbed from the land on which they depend. But in the long term, the reform scenario is one, as its name, in fact, already indicates, that will take time. It will also require breaking down cultural prejudice against small-scale farming and the belief of the elites that it is not something that can actually benefit the long-term development of the country. One of the most distressing findings in my job is that actually, in many cases, the representations that governments of the North have of what modernization of agriculture means are representations that are shared by developing countries' governments who do not believe that there is any future for small farmers. And the Ethiopian, the late Meles Zenawi, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, is representative of that view. And so I accept the burden of having to prove that it is worthwhile investing in them and in women in particular, as agriculture is increasingly feminized in many developing countries. But I agree with the counter-arguments you put forward and the risks of the reform not being easy to achieve. Sir, thank you for your question on East Jerusalem and the occupied Palestinian territories more generally. I do hope you haven't come to this only for that question, because I have nothing to say. Unfortunately, it is very difficult for us special rapporteurs of the UN human rights system to document this, simply because it is not easy to be authorized to travel in Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, and to monitor the situation there on the ground. So I'm sorry, I have nothing to report on this, and I wish I would not disappoint you this way, but I really have no fresh information on this. land speculation, how much does it represent? Well, it's difficult to quantify. You see, we should, I'm not sure whether you're an economist or not, but there is in economics this very strong, resilient but false idea that there's a natural value to things, right? A sort of like in the Ricardian tradition that Marx already also inherited from. There is this idea that things have a natural value, a natural price. The reward, for example, is the work invested in producing it in Locke's tradition. But that's just not true. The price given to things is the result of, you know, the pull of the supply and demand and the purchasing power of those buying and selling in need or not in need of the thing in question. And so there's no natural price of land against which you could compare what is the price that results from speculation. Speculation means, so it's not quantifiable. What we do know is that once land is commoditized, becomes an asset that can be exchanged and land markets become liquid, immediately the price people are ready to pay climbs by about 25–30%. Is this speculation? Well, some would say yes, and others would say no. It's just because people have a way to make land more productive, and that once they have a title, they know that it's worth investing, and so it may not be just speculation. And
that wasn't his point. His point was that if they're absentee landlords that are not trying to use the land because they own it only for investment, then it may be possible for you to be successful in protecting the people who live there. I think that was the point.
So that's right. So indeed, so that's another question. It's true that we have a significant percentage of these large-scale investments in farmland that have not led as yet to agro-industrial projects being developed. And apparently land is held by some major investors, particularly investment funds from this country, the US, simply because it's an interesting asset class which is less volatile in the value it has than other asset classes such as, you know, stocks or state bonds. So they hold on to the land in the hope that its value shall increase. And it's estimated that maybe 20% of the land that has changed hands is simply land that is held with this speculative motive behind this. And yes, it is also an important fact because it refutes this idea that by allowing investors to buy land, we allow land to be more productive. In fact, in many cases, land is less productive because it's just held on hold without it being put to good use.
And the people who used to be working there when it was owned by the state, where it's located, are no longer allowed. They're kept from working the land.
Well, I suppose that may happen, although what I've seen in most cases is that investors come in, they buy, they don't know exactly what they want to do with this, they just speculate. And people just continue as if nothing happened. They are not even informed sometimes of the fact that, you know, underneath their crops, the owner has changed hands. So it's only when the project actually becomes implemented that they are actually evicted, that, you know, they are removed from the land and land is developed to produce something else. Right? So, and it can take years, in fact, in some cases. So the last question was about very controversial topic, as you may have not suspected. What private investment can actually contribute? Now, look, there are two views on this, which I'm both sympathetic to, but are not easy to reconcile. One view is we need to allow small-scale farmers to be self-sufficient, not to have to depend on access to investors, they should be allowed to produce their own inputs and to produce, to enter into a no cash economy, or an economy at least that requires very little cash to produce and so on. And the idea there is we have to respect their desire for autonomy and independence. In that view, under that approach, it's difficult to see what useful role investors could play. Another approach is to say, well, for the moment, these small-scale farmers are not managing well enough. They are unable to improve the productivity of their land. They are unable to invest in, for example, storage facilities, or to have access to markets because they are not well connected to these markets. And we need to support them by investments going to improving their productivity. And for example, various contract farming schemes could allow for this, in which companies interested in buying crops support these farmers by promising to buy their crops at sometimes a predefined price, provide access to inputs, provide access to credit, provide, of course, access to markets per definition, and allow these small-scale farmers to improve their production by switching at least part of their production to the production for the market, for cash crops that the buyer shall acquire, purchase, sometimes increasing the cash incomes for these farmers. And I met people I respect, trust, who are very hostile to contract farming because they see this as an attempt to shift agriculture towards an increased level of capitalization and to disown, essentially, small-scale farmers from the ability to control their production, right? They would, at the limit, become poorly paid agricultural workers on their own land, producing for someone else, rather than remaining in control of their own production. I prepared to try to, arbitrate between these different views. I prepared a report on contract farming where I tried to show that contract farming could be an adequate solution under certain conditions, inter alia, that not all the land should go to producing cash crops bought by the investor in order to maintain a certain level of self-sufficiency and to avoid a risk of farming families becoming totally dependent on the price that is paid for the crops that they produce for someone else. That is one of the proposals I made. I listed actually 7 conditions under which contract farming could be a desirable option. But the question you raised, I should say, is absolutely key because it brings us to the core question, that is, if you wish, the unspoken controversy behind these debates. I took part in a number of discussions between farming communities and investors, including, philanthropic foundations wanting to help, well-intended, but not understanding often the perverse impacts of their interventions. And the debate between these farming communities and these investors, even philanthropic foundations, is always a dialogue of the deaf, because they don't understand that they share very different views as to the future of farming and the purposes of farming. To a large extent, these farming communities are not thinking of farming as an investment. They think of farming as a way to provide food to their families and communities. They don't have the ambition of making profit from selling on the markets. And they fear, most of all, to become dependent on having to buy inputs, on having to sell their crops on the markets to have access to these inputs, and on having to mortgage their land to have access to credit and so forth. They want autonomy, they want self-sufficiency, and they relate this to the paradigm of food sovereignty. In many ways, these farming communities are the last frontier of the global deployment of the capitalist mentality. And they remind me in many cases of these pre-capitalist societies that Max Weber, in his work on the Protestant, the spirit of the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism described, in which communities are gradually taught to become capitalists, to become entrepreneurs by entering into these market relationships. That debate is a debate we still must have, but in many cases we remain at, at the level of technicalities without entering into a discussion between these different worldviews. But that is ultimately the key question that your question raises.
Let's take one more round of questions. The odd thing is that we are where we are because of 20 years of neoliberalism. But many of the things that you said, like price support for crops, and governments used to do that. But then they would lecture that they shouldn't be intervening in markets. So anyway, that's a long story. But let's get 4 more questions. Sir, you, and come on up. Go ahead.
Some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are adopting laws, or considering adopting laws that involve a couple of mechanisms that are administrative as responses to the problem of land grabbing. Some involve administrative processes whereby, in order to combine lands into larger parcels, you have to go through various administrative steps. Some talk about confiscating lands that are not being used and reallocated. What do you think of these as response mechanisms?
Okay. Let's, I think you are here.
I have 2 very brief questions. One is just going back to your last question, and you talk about the sort of small-scale form of fear, becoming dependent on external inputs and trying to avoid that. Is that something you're seeing as sort of a learned experience, a learned fear from an experience of pre-revolution technologies and becoming very dependent on external inputs, or is that not something that's come out of sort of a historical background? And then my other question is that you mentioned earlier that Brazil was a good model of sort of this third alternative pathway, I guess. Do you mean all of Brazil or just certain areas of Brazil? Can you talk a bit more about that?
So you're at the back?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could address the role of the state when we're talking about basic infrastructure, because it seems to me in my research, the land grab issue and the issues that these folks are facing in terms of lack of economic and political power, a lot of it has to do with there's a lot of underlying issues of lack of roads and lack of water. And it seems like that's a place where the international community could really have an impact in terms of both political pressure and financing, and that could empower these people more than almost anything. But I wondered if you could address that issue of roads and water and responsibility of governments.
Okay, one more? Yeah, okay.
Let's take a step back and talk about the food prices that you mentioned at the beginning that are driving this. Now, given our agreement that the market speculation in the commodities market and also ethanol conversion from corn in the U.S. are primary causes of the food prices, and recently we've seen both the CFTC regulations stopped by the courts and the EPA not taking advantage of a great opportunity, let's say, to stop the ethanol mandate this year after the drought. I would be interested to hear your comments about the current status of U.S. regulations and how we might advance those causes. I think that's a good question.
Okay, so I'll be as brief as possible in my answers. First of all, on the legal reforms that we are now witnessing, they are in fact quite diverse. Quite a few countries now impose limits on how much land can be acquired by foreigners. Some others, as you said, have imposed more constraints on investors and a better scrutiny of their intentions and the business plan that they present. But frankly, these countries are often facing a double-bind situation in which on the one hand they want to strengthen these processes and increase transparency and the quality, if you wish, of the investments coming in. On the other hand, and Mozambique is one example, it has a law of 1997, which is often seen as a model law others should seek inspiration from. But on the other hand, they are told by the International Finance Corporation, for example, that they should cut down the red tape and encourage investment and facilitate as much as possible the acquisition of land by investors in order to accelerate economic growth and the arrival of investment in agriculture. It's very difficult for them to manage these conflicting expectations. I was, for example, in Cameroon in July, and I encouraged the Cameroonese government to impose higher fees on foreign forest users, right, who exploit this excellent tropical forests that the country has, paying a very low fee to the government. And the answer of the government was, well, we are told it's too high to attract investors, which is not true, because actually there are many investors wanting to pass contracts with the Cameroon government. But that is what they are told by the IMF. So it is a problem that these legal reforms are now disputed in the very objectives that they ought to prioritize today, because we do need investment in order to make up for these 30 years of underinvestment in agriculture in these countries. The second question was, well, there were two questions, whether the fear of being co-opted into capitalist modes of production was based on historical experience. Not always. Not always. Sometimes it is the case, but some regions in sub-Saharan Africa have never actually witnessed the Green Revolution. They have heard sometimes of the experience of other regions, such as India most notably, and some transnational networks of small-scale farmers, such as the Via Campesina, link these African smallholders to experience from other regions, but in many cases, this is not based on experience. It's based on a different perception of how land is most useful to them, and land is most useful to them if they are allowed to produce food in good conditions for themselves, rather than it being used in a more risky way to produce for the markets and as an economic asset that you lose if you make the wrong investments. That is what they fear most of all, right? So I believe we should support them in producing better, but the priority should go to protecting them from the risk of losing off their land if they take risks which are not calculating well, and if they become vulnerable to economic shocks. But I think, first of all, we have to have a dialogue about them and what they really want, and in many cases they are not consulted in the grand plans that we are developing for them in the name of a new green revolution. You also asked about Brazil. Well, Brazil is an interesting example, which I mentioned not as an example of a reform scenario having succeeded, but as an example of a coexistence scenario being managed relatively well by a government which has deliberately chosen to have two separate ministries, one to support the large-scale, extremely competitive agricultural producers that flood the global markets with, crops that are produced in highly competitive conditions, and on the other hand, a ministerial department that supports small-scale farmers, a ministry for rural development that provides them with specific access to credit and support, allowing them to not just survive, but indeed to thrive. Now, of course, the family farmer in Brazil cannot be compared to the small-scale farmer in Burkina Faso or Mali. The family farmer in Brazil will have 20, 25 hectares, when the small-scale farmer in Burkina Faso or Mali, or indeed Andhra Pradesh, shall have 2 hectares at its disposal, or less even. Right? So these comparisons are difficult to make. But if we want to look at a country which has succeeded in managing this coexistence, I think Brazil scores quite well in this regard. The role of government in providing infrastructure is absolutely vital. Many studies show that public goods, such as storage facilities, roads, extension services to provide adequate advice to farmers, is extremely effective in reducing rural poverty. Much more effective than the distribution of private goods, such as fertilizers, pesticides, improved varieties of seeds, for example, although in many cases, as a reaction to the current global food price crisis, governments have prioritized the delivery of private goods. In part, this is because it's an easy way to buy political loyalty and to make yourself popular with the voters. There are reports on this showing how, in many cases, the way inputs are distributed is biased because of these, the interest governments have in buying this loyalty of voters. So I think more investment should go into public goods, and I do believe, like you seem to believe, that the international community should support that as a matter of priority. One, I suppose, challenge we are facing, and with this I'm beginning to enter into your question, is that governments, although they make many commitments and make many promises, do not have budgets that really can provoke this reinvestment in agriculture that we need. And governments from the south and from the north depend on the private sector for this new agricultural development revolution to develop. And for this very reason, they call upon the private sector for support. For example, the G20 has established a new alliance for food and nutrition security that basically mobilizes the private sector for investment in Africa in particular, essentially accepting the risk that the agenda of development shall be dictated by the private sector's interests. And of course, companies such as Cargill and Bunge will be interested in capturing this opportunity to secure their supply of crops. Fertilizers companies such as Yara or Syngenta will be interested in these new markets as, providing them with new clients for the products that they themselves sell. And the risk, if you wish, is that if we leave the priorities to be defined by the private sector, if governments, because they need the money from the private sector, the investment from the private sector, do not define themselves the priorities, we will not have a development that is most conducive of the reduction of rural poverty, and that is the danger we are facing. The US, I think, has a very important role to play in this regard. It has done some interesting things. For example, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of July 2010 was, at the time, the most advanced piece of legislation to reduce the negative impacts of speculation by financial actors on agricultural commodities markets. But you rightly noted that the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, has found it very difficult to implement the legislative mandate under the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, and that the US is still a culprit as regards biofuels production. 40% of the maize produced in the US today goes to ethanol production today. It's having a huge impact on the price of maize on global markets, and it is completely foolish if you look at the energy and environmental balance of ethanol produced from maize in this country. And I believe that the US should renounce these, and that this is one major factor that triggers not just food prices increase, but also speculation on land. And then let me close by correcting myself on one point. I mentioned that the prices should not be seen as linked to some natural price of commodities or land. And I said the price is really the result of supply and demand. That actually is a simplification. It is the result not of supply and demand, it's the result of power relationships exercised in the food chains. And I mention this because I think we have underestimated in the range of options explored to address food security, we have underestimated the need to tackle imbalances of power in the food chains and in the food systems, and particularly the disempowerment of small-scale farmers vis-à-vis both the providers of inputs and the buyers of agricultural commodities, and strengthening the ability for small-scale farmers to be better organized, to have a better bargaining position in the food systems is absolutely key to allow them to have a better reward for the work that they are responsible for. So it is an oversimplification to say that the price is a result of supply and demand. It's not even that. It is really the result of